In the early hours of 22 October 1938, in a Moscow that smelled of damp stone and coal smoke, a marshal of the Soviet Union was quietly erased, not removed from command with ceremony, not retired with speeches, but taken under guard into the Lubyanka's shadow world, where the state's most decorated soldiers could disappear as if they had never existed. His name was Vasily Konstantinovich Blucher, and Joseph Stalin feared him enough to destroy him. To understand why, you have to picture the kind of man Blucher was in the Soviet imagination before he became an embarrassment, a threat, and finally a corpse in an NKVD cell. He was not a paper general, not a red professor made by the academy. He was a Civil War commander, a man with mud on his boots and a reputation that began before the Soviet Union itself had fully hardened into a state. In the late 1930s, that kind of reputation could be more dangerous than any foreign spy ring. Stalin had built a system where legitimacy came from him, flowed from him, and could be revoked by him. Blucher's legitimacy came from somewhere else, from war, from victory, from the kind of charisma that survives orders and outlives newspapers. The irony is that Blucher should have been one of the safest men in the USSR. He was a loyal Bolshevik commander and one of the first 5 marshals of the Soviet Union when that rank was created in September 1935, alongside Kliment Voroshilov, Semyon Budyonny, Alexander Yegorov, and Mikhail Tukhachevsky. His chest carried the symbols the regime loved: medals, orders, citations. Yet those symbols could also become a liability. In Stalin's state, fame was never just praise. It was a form of independent power, and independent power was a disease. Blucher's story starts far from the marble corridors of the Kremlin. Born in 1819 at the Russian Empire, he came from the lower depths of society, exactly the kind of biography that the Bolsheviks could present as proof that history itself had changed direction. He fought in the First World War and, like millions of others, was thrown into the furnace where the old army shattered and the new one was forced into existence. In the civil war that followed the Bolshevik Revolution, Blucher gained a reputation for bold operations and the kind of endurance that turned commanders into legends. One of the most famous episodes tied to his name was the 1918 raid across the Urals by Red forces, an operation that entered Soviet law. He became one of the earliest recipients of the Order of the Red Banner, one of the Soviet states' first and most important military decorations, in a regime obsessed with the mythology of its own birth that mattered. By the 1920s, Blucher had become the kind of figure the party both needed and distrusted, a commander with prestige among soldiers, veterans, and regional elites. The Soviet Union in its first 2 decades was held together by violence, ideology, and a constant fear that it could fall apart into peasant rebellion, nationalist separatism, foreign intervention, or internal coup. Stalin's ascent in the 1920s was not just a bureaucratic victory over rivals like Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, and later Bukharin. It was a transformation of the entire state into a machine where loyalty was measured not by past service, but by present obedience. A Civil War hero who had grown famous before Stalin fully consolidated power was always going to be suspect. The question was not whether Blucher would be tested. It was when. His posting would make the stakes even sharper. Blucher became the dominant military figure in the Soviet Far East, a region of immense distances and immense strategic danger. On a map, the Far East looks like a vast emptiness of forest, rivers, and mountains. On the ground in the 1920s and 1930s, it was a tense frontier pressed against Japan's expanding empire and the fragile, shifting political reality of China. The Soviet leadership feared invasion, sabotage, and encirclement. Stalin feared something else as well, that a powerful commander, far away from Moscow, controlling large forces, could become a state within the state. In the Far East, that risk was not theoretical. Communications were slow compared to European Russia, and the center's control could feel distant. Commanders there dealt with border incidents, smuggling, intelligence wars, and the possibility of sudden escalation. Blucher's authority was not only military, it was political in practice, because the military was the backbone of Soviet control in a borderland where external enemies and internal instability blended together. His reputation grew further with the 1929 conflict over the Chinese Eastern Railway, a crisis that showed how quickly the Far East could ignite. That railway, built under Imperial Russia, running through Manchuria, was a strategic artery and a political symbol. In 1929, tensions with the Chinese warlord Zhang Shuiliang escalated into armed conflict. Soviet forces intervened, and the fighting became a test of Soviet capability after years of internal chaos. The Soviet victory in that conflict strengthened the regime's claim that it could defend its interests and project power. Blucher's role as a senior commander in the Far East during that period added to his stature. Victories in far-off places were the kind of thing that created legends, especially when the average Soviet citizen had only the newspaper's dramatic language to imagine what the frontier looked like. Then Japan changed everything. In September 1931, Japan seized Manchuria in the Mukden incident and established the puppet state of Manchukuo in 1932. Suddenly, Blyoka's theater was no longer a remote backwater. It became one of the most dangerous borders on Earth. Japan's Kwantan army was aggressive, ideologically driven, and not always fully controlled even by Tokyo. The Soviet Union watched Japanese expansion with dread. A hostile modern army now sat on its doorstep, with ambitions that could point north toward Siberia as easily as they pointed south toward China. Stalin's nightmare was a two-front war: Germany in the west and Japan in the east, while the USSR was still industrializing, still traumatized by famine, still tearing itself apart with collectivization and political terror. In that nightmare, the Far East mattered more than ever. And the man who held the Far East mattered too. By the mid-1930s, the Soviet Union was deep into a paranoid spiral. Stalin and his inner circle saw conspiracies everywhere, and paranoia wasn't just a personal flaw. It became a method of governance. The Great Purge accelerated after the assassination of Sergei Kirov in December 1934. And by 1936 to 1938, it reached into every institution: the party, the state bureaucracy, industry, intelligence, and the Red Army. The purges were not simply about removing enemies, they were about removing enemies. They were about removing enemies. They were about removing alternatives, anyone who could plausibly command loyalty outside Stalin's personal network. The military was especially sensitive. Armies are the one institution that can overthrow a government if they decide to. Stalin understood that. He had watched the Russian Empire collapse partly because the army disintegrated. He had seen how political power in the Civil War often followed men who controlled armed forces. A popular general was not just a subordinate, he was a potential rival. In June 1937, the Soviet Union publicly destroyed one of its most brilliant commanders, Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, along with other senior officers, after a closed trial on accusations of conspiracy and treason. Tukhachevsky was executed on the 12th June 1937. That moment sent a shockwave through the entire officer corps. It also set a precedent. If a marshal could be shot, nobody was safe. Blucher watched this from his Far Eastern command, and he would have understood the message. But what did Stalin see when he looked at Blucher? He saw distance. Blucher was far away, commanding forces that could not be instantly replaced if something went wrong. He saw a man with a heroic biography that the propaganda machine had helped build, but could not fully control. He saw a commander who dealt directly with a hostile foreign power along a volatile frontier, a man who had to make decisions quickly in situations where Moscow's directives might arrive too late. And he saw something else, something subtle but deadly in Stalin's world. Blucher had a reputation for being blunt, for having his own view of military matters, for not always fitting neatly into the role of a silent executor. In a normal military system, independence of judgment is an asset. In Stalin's system, it was evidence. The tension in the Far East became more than political. It became physical, measured in gunfire and bodies. Border clashes between Soviet and Japanese forces were not rare in the late 1930s. The frontier was a place where maps were contested and patrols tested each other. One of the most significant clashes before the famous 1939 Battle of Khalkhin Gol was the conflict at Lake Khasan in the summer of 1938. Lake Khasan lies near the border of the Soviet Union, Manchukuo, and Korea, a region of hills and marshy lowlands where visibility can be limited and movement can be miserable. In July 1938, Japanese and Soviet forces clashed over disputed territory around heights near the lake, particularly the hills known as Lauzanaya and Bezymyanya. What could have remained a small border incident escalated into a serious engagement involving artillery, tanks, infantry, and air power. It became a test not only of Soviet readiness, but of command competence under pressure. This is where Blöcher's fate began to narrow like a noose. On paper, the Soviet Union should have been able to crush a local Japanese incursion quickly. The USSR had large forces in the Far East. It had tanks, artillery, and air assets. It also had one critical weakness that Stalin himself had created. The purges had hollowed out the officer corps, spreading fear and punishing initiative. When commanders are terrified of making the wrong decision politically, they often make the wrong decision militarily. They become cautious, rigid, slow. They wait for orders. They avoid responsibility. They do what looks safest on paper. At Lake Khasan, Soviet forces ultimately pushed the Japanese back, but at significant cost and with a level of operational chaos that alarmed Moscow. The fighting lasted into August 1938, and while the Soviets declared victory, the campaign exposed problems, poor coordination, logistical failures, communications breakdowns, and tactical missteps. Tanks bogged down, units attacked without proper reconnaissance, and leadership faltered in moments where speed and clarity mattered. In the Soviet Union of 1938, battlefield performance was not evaluated only as a military matter. It was a political judgment, a potential criminal case. Under Stalin, failure was rarely an honest mistake. It was sabotage, treason, or cowardice. And who would be blamed if the Far Eastern Command looked incompetent? The commander-in-chief of that theatre was Blöcher. The tragedy is that Blöcher was not a marginal figure who could be dismissed quietly. He was a marshal. He was the face of Soviet military authority in the Far East. If he was judged responsible for shortcomings at Khasan, he could not simply be demoted. In Stalin's logic, someone at that level who failed was either a traitor or a symbol of a system that needed to be purged. There was also another element, darker and more personal. Stalin's political environment encouraged subordinates to protect themselves by shifting blame upward. When things went wrong, people competed to prove they were not responsible, and the easiest way to do that was to accuse someone else. The NKVD, under Nikolai Yeshov during the peak of the Great Purge, had built an empire of denunciations, coerced confessions, and manufactured conspiracies. In that world, a military setback was not just an embarrassment, it was raw material for an arrest. Blöcher's situation in 1938 was therefore uniquely dangerous. He was responsible for a critical frontier. He had a powerful command. He had a public reputation. And after Lake Khasan, he had something that could be framed as failure. Stalin did not need absolute proof that Blöcher was disloyal. Proof was not the point. The point was control. A man like Blöcher represented a potential alternative center of authority, one that might matter in a crisis. Imagine Stalin's perspective in that year. In the West, Adolf Hitler had annexed Austria in March 1938 and was threatening Czechoslovakia, culminating in the Munich Agreement in September 1938. Europe was sliding toward war. In the east, Japan was deep into its war in China after 1937, and the possibility of Japanese escalation against the USSR was real. Stalin's system was built on fear, but fear cuts both ways. The more power Stalin accumulated, the more he feared losing it. What if a war went badly? What if the Far East erupted while Germany threatened in the West? What if Moscow needed a strong, popular commander, someone the army respected more than the party bureaucrats? Would that man be content to remain merely a subordinate if the state began to wobble? Stalin had seen history. He had read it in the harshest way. He knew what a Bonaparte was, a military leader who turns victory, or even the promise of stability, into political power. The Soviet state publicly claimed it had abolished the conditions for such a thing, but Stalin's purges were an admission that he didn't believe his own propaganda. He knew the army could produce a rival, and Blücher's entire biography screamed independent warlord to a mind trained in conspiracies, Civil War hero, decorated commander, long tenure in a distant strategic region, deep familiarity with local networks, and the loyalty of soldiers who had served under him. In a dictatorship, the qualities that make a general effective can be the same qualities that make him unacceptable. After Lake Khasan, the knife came out. In the autumn of 1938, Stalin moved against Blücher. The exact mechanisms of how high-level purges were triggered can be murky because they involved internal party decisions, NKVD investigations, and the toxic atmosphere of coerced testimony. But the result is clear and documented in outcome. Blücher was arrested in October 1938 and interrogated by the NKVD. He was accused of participating in a military fascist conspiracy and of espionage accusations that had been used against countless others, including Tukhachevsky the year before. The details of Blücher's final days are among the bleakest in Soviet military history. He did not receive a public trial like some earlier purged figures. He was taken into custody and subjected to interrogation and torture. He died in prison on 9 November 1938 in Moscow's Lefortovo prison, before any formal sentencing could play out in a courtroom. A marshal, one of the highest-ranking men in the entire armed forces, dead in custody like a nameless criminal. There is something chilling about that date. November 1938 was also the moment when the purge machine itself was changing hands. Nikolai Yezhov, the NKVD chief, who presided over the bloodiest period of the Great Purge, was being replaced by Lavrenti Beria. Stalin would later have Yezhov arrested and executed. The system devoured even its executioners. Blücher died at the hinge of that transition, as if the state needed one last sacrifice from the old terror before the new one could begin. So why did Stalin fear him enough to do this? Because fear in Stalin's Soviet Union was not always triggered by what someone did. It was triggered by what someone was. Blücher was the living memory of a time when the Bolshevik state was not yet a rigid pyramid with Stalin at the top, but a chaotic coalition of armed factions and strong personalities. Those personalities had won the Civil War, and they had learned that power could be seized, held, and justified by force. Stalin, who had emerged as the ultimate bureaucratic victor, never forgot that lesson. The men who had gained authority through fighting were the men most likely to understand that authority could be taken away through fighting too. Blücher was also dangerous because he was stationed where the Soviet Union could least afford uncertainty. The Far East was not a ceremonial posting. It was a front line against Japan. If war broke out, the commander there would control massive forces and make life and death decisions far from the Kremlin. Stalin could not tolerate the possibility, however remote, that such a man might act with too much autonomy in wartime, or that his popularity could make him indispensable. And then there was the most Soviet motive of all, the need for a scapegoat. Lake Khasan had revealed serious weaknesses. The purges had already removed many experienced commanders and staff officers. Training, doctrine, and initiative had been damaged by fear. But Stalin could not admit that the system he had created, his Tiretta, his political interference, his destruction of competence, had weakened the army. To admit that would be to admit fallibility. Dictatorships do not survive admissions of fallibility. They survive by turning failures into crimes committed by enemies. Blücher, as the senior commander, was the perfect vessel for that logic. If things went badly, it wasn't because the Red Army had been crippled by political purges. It was because Blücher was a traitor, or incompetent, or both. Remove him, and the system could claim it had purified itself. The problems would be blamed on a man, not on the structure. The human cost of that logic is hard to overstate. In 1937-1938, the Red Army lost a staggering number of officers to arrest, execution, dismissal, or imprisonment. Exact numbers vary by source and definition, but the scale is undisputed. Tens of thousands of officers were affected, including senior commanders, staff specialists, and experienced professionals. The purge did not merely remove bad apples. It tore out institutional memory. It punished creativity. It taught an entire generation of commanders that survival depended on political safety, not military truth. Blücher's death was part of that catastrophe. And yet, history does not stop for purges. Japan did not pause its ambitions out of respect for Soviet internal terror. Germany did not delay its plans because Stalin was busy executing his own generals. Less than 3 years after Blücher died in Lefortovo, Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union on 22 June 1941. The USSR faced the greatest military crisis in its history. In the opening months of Operation Barbarossa, Soviet forces suffered colossal losses, millions of prisoners, huge encirclements, entire armies shattered. The Red Army eventually recovered and fought back with extraordinary resilience, but the early disaster was shaped in part by the damage done to command and control in the late 1930s. The Soviet state had murdered its own expertise. In the Far East, Blücher's absence also echoed. In 1939, the Soviet Union fought Japan again in a much larger and more decisive conflict at Khalkhin Gol, also known as the Nomonhan Incident, along the border between Mongolia and Manchukuo. This time the Soviet forces under General Georgy Zhukov delivered a major defeat to the Japanese, using massed armor, artillery, and a double envelopment that became famous. That victory helped discourage Japan from pursuing a strike north strategy against the USSR, pushing it instead toward the Pacific and Southeast Asia, one of the strategic shifts that would eventually lead to Pearl Harbor in December 1941. It is tempting to imagine Blücher in that moment, to wonder what role he might have played if he had lived. But speculation is a luxury historians cannot afford. What we can say, grounded in the record, is that Blücher's removal was part of a broader pattern. Stalin preferred commanders who were politically safe over commanders who were independently authoritative. Zhukov survived not because Stalin trusted generals, but because Zhukov's victories became indispensable and because Stalin constantly balanced fear of the army with fear of defeat. Blücher never got the chance to become indispensable again. His erasure also tells you something about Soviet memory. The Soviet Union was capable of turning yesterday's hero into today's traitor with terrifying speed. A man could be celebrated in newspapers one month and wiped from photographs the next. His name could vanish from official histories. His family could be punished. His achievements could be reassigned to others or buried under silence. Even the rank of marshal did not protect him. That is the key detail that makes Blücher's story so unsettling. The Soviet state created the title of Marshal of the Soviet Union in 1935 to elevate and formalize military prestige, to signal strength to both domestic and foreign audiences. Blücher was chosen as one of the first 5, a symbolic pantheon. Within 3 years, 2 of those first 5 marshals, Tukhachevsky and Blücher, were dead as traitors, and another, Alexander Yegorov, would also be arrested and executed. Yegorov was executed in February 1939. The title did not represent safety, it represented visibility, and visibility, and visibility could be fatal. The method of Bleicher's deaf dying under interrogation before formal sentencing also reveals how the Soviet terror functioned at its most extreme. The goal was not justice, or even the appearance of justice. The goal was removal. Once the state decided a person was dangerous, the process could be as crude as necessary. Torture was not a secret aberration. It was part of the machinery. Confessions were not evidence. They were tools for validating decisions already made. What did Stalin gain by destroying Bleicher? He gained a Far East command purged of a powerful personality, replaced by men who owed their careers to the center's favor and who understood that survival depended on obedience. He gained a scapegoat for the problems revealed at Lake Khasan. He gained another warning example to frighten the rest of the armed forces. If a marshal could die in prison, then a colonel, a major, a captain had no hope of resistance. But what Stalin didn't gain, and what he could never fully gain, was the elimination of the underlying fear, because fear, like Stalin's, is not cured by removing threats. It is fed by the act of removal. Every purge creates new enemies in the dictator's imagination, because the dictator begins to see how many enemies could have existed undetected. If Blucher, a marshal, could be a traitor, then anyone could be. And if anyone could be, then everyone must be watched. That is the treadmill of terror. It never reaches the finish line. Blucher's long-term legacy is therefore larger than his own biography. His story is a window into how the Soviet system treated competence, charisma, and independent authority. The system needed talented commanders, especially in a world sliding toward global war, but it also needed them to be politically harmless. Bleicher was not harmless, not because he was plotting a coup. There is no credible evidence that he was, but because his very existence contradicted the regime's demand that all loyalty and legitimacy flow from Stalin alone. In the years after Stalin's death, in 1953, the Soviet Union began, cautiously and unevenly, to confront the crimes of the terror. Nikita Khrushchev's secret speech in February 1956 denounced aspects of Stalin's cult of personality and the mass repression. Many victims were posthumously rehabilitated in legal and political terms, their cases reviewed, their convictions overturned, their names partially restored. Bleicher was among those later rehabilitated, recognized as a victim of fabricated accusations. Yet rehabilitation could not restore what was actually taken: years of life, the knowledge in a commander's head, the trust inside an institution, the sense that service and sacrifice would be honored rather than weaponized. And even rehabilitation did not always revive memory. Some names returned to textbooks and public monuments. Others remained half buried, known to specialists, veterans' families, and archivists, but not to the wider world. Blucher became, in a sense, doubly erased, first by Stalin's terror, and then by the passage of time, which is often kinder to the famous than to the merely important. That is why his story still grips the throat when you let it play out in full. It's not simply the tragedy of one man, it's the tragedy of a state that could not tolerate strength unless it was completely controlled, a state that could not tolerate heroes unless it could own them. Imagine the atmosphere of those last months in 1938, the sound of boots in stairwells at night, the constant anxiety of denunciation, the way people learned to speak in cautious fragments. In that world, Blucher's decorations and titles would not have felt like armor. They would have felt like targets. The very symbols of his service, his marshal's star, his orders, his Civil War prestige became markers that made him too visible to ignore and too powerful to trust. Stalin feared Blucher because Blucher represented a kind of authority that Stalin could not manufacture at will. Party appointments can be granted and revoked. Newspaper praise can be printed and withdrawn. But the loyalty of soldiers who have followed a commander through real battles, the respect earned in mud and blood, is different. It does not always obey the calendar of political favor. It can outlast propaganda. It can become stubborn. It can become, in the mind of a dictator, the seed of an alternative future. And in Stalin's Soviet Union, an alternative future was the most unforgivable crime of all. The uncomfortable reflection, looking back from the modern world, is how easily systems of fear can turn competence into suspicion and success into danger. Bleicher's case is a reminder that authoritarian power does not merely destroy its enemies. It often destroys the very people it needs most because it cannot distinguish strength from threat. When a state begins to fear its own servants more than it fears its external rivals, it starts to rot from the inside, even if it looks strong from the outside. Vasily Blücher was not defeated by Japan at Lake Khasan. He was defeated by the logic of Stalinism, a logic in which the safest general was not the best one, but the most controllable one, and where the most decorated hero could be reduced in a matter of weeks to a body on a prison floor. In the end, Stalin did not just fear a forgotten general. He feared what that general proved, that power can be earned in ways a dictator cannot fully command, and that history has a habit of remembering what regimes try hardest to erase,